GTV. Acharya Nagarjuna Viswavidyalayanlo Marginality and Multicultural Literary Natives from Australia and India అనే అంశంపై 3 రోజుల గ్లోబల్ సదస్సు విశ్వవిద్యాలయంలోని డైట్మెంట్ ఆడిటోరియంలో అట్టహాసంగా ప్రారంభమైంది. ప్రారంభ సభకు యూనివర్సిటీ బీసీ మరియు డైరెక్టర్ అయిన ప్రొఫెసర్ పట్టేటి రాజశేఖర్ అధ్యక్షత వహించారు.
భారత్లోని దళితులు, ఆస్ట్రేలియాలోని అబార్జినల్స్ స్థితిగతులు, వారు ఎదుర్కొంటున్న వివక్ష వంటి అంశాలపై సదస్సులో చర్చ జరగనుంది. సదస్సుకు ఆస్ట్రేలియా నుంచి ప్రొఫెసర్ జిలియన్ డూలే, అమెరికాలోని నార్త్ కరోలినా యూనివర్సిటీ నుంచి ప్రొఫెసర్ ఫ్రాంక్ హెచ్ దినా, ప్రొఫెసర్ అంచుమన్కర్, ప్రొఫెసర్ ఆమ్స్ట్రాంగ్లతో పాటు ఆస్ట్రేలియన్ స్టడీస్ విభాగాధిపతి ప్రొఫెసర్ చెన్నారెడ్డి, వర్సిటీ రెక్టార్ ప్రొఫెసర్ మూర్తి, రిజిస్ట్రార్ ప్రొఫెసర్ బి కరుణ తదితరులు మాట్లాడారు. ఈ సందర్భంగా వారు భారత్, ఆస్ట్రేలియాల మధ్య ఎన్నో రకాల పరస్పర సంబంధాలు కొనసాగుతున్నాయని, రెండు దేశాల అభివృద్ధిలో క్రీడలు, వ్యాపారం వంటి అంశాలతో పాటు సాంస్కృతిక అంశాలపై కూడా ఫోకస్ చేయాల్సిన అవసరం ఉందని పేర్కొన్నారు. తద్వారా మల్టీకల్చరల్ డైమండ్ సెన్స్ అభివృద్ధి చెందడానికి అవకాశం ఉంటుందని వివరించారు.
Coral and temperate reefs, open oceans, wetlands and rainforests. The usual description, Wikipedia description that you get when you try to know something about Australia. But comparing it with India is a scholarly persuasion, because India and Australia are the countries that had colonial experience, that had colonial rule. But of course, ideologically or in terms of contestation, many people say that though India was ruled by the Britishers for 300 years or 400 years, you have internal colonization in India. Okay. Internal colonization, before India was colonized by the external forces, the internal dominating forces, the social forces, had already colonized the natives of India or the aborigines of India. Of course, this can be contested ideologically and philosophically also. But whenever we talk about the aspect of extending fourth-world identity to Dalits, Adivasis, and to the tribes of India, comparing them with the Native Americans, comparing them with the Australian aborigines, comparing them with the First Nations of Canada. This is a vertical aspect which emanates from the minds of the people, and this is being seriously discussed and contested, right now across the nation. Okay. So India, in addition to sharing Anglo-imperial past, it also shares the aspect of minority or the status of minority when we compare the tribals, Dalits and Adivasis of India with the Australian indigenous groups. But the presence of the Australian indigenous groups is slowly coming down. They are into dismemberment, they are into dispersal, they are leading towards complete annihilation due to the policies that were adopted and implemented by Australian government. So the pan-Indian aboriginal identity, where the Australian aboriginals are clamoring for, is in opposition to pan-Australia's white settler identity. I am not going into the fundamental details of Australia, that it is a settler colony or a settler nation, and it was used only for penalizing the criminals quite for some time. Though the writers, the white writers who have settled in Australia, though they have tried their best to write the best literature, they were always confronted with the hostile environment. In addition to confronting hostile environment, they were also confronted with the presence of incredible indigenous groups and the experiences related to their lives. So pan-Indian aboriginal identity, the fourth world identity that I am talking about, comes in constant confrontation with the and wide depends completely in the appropriation of Aboriginal culture. Don't want to go into the details of all these things completely because in the process of
waited a special quality of response, and there was nothing. It was like being denied part of my reality. And I think that's a very interesting statement about not multicultural in this sort of official sense, as Australia has been, but in the literally multicultural state of somewhere like Trinidad. And I've just spent a week in Mauritius, which is another very mixed multicultural society. And although I haven't yet been in Trinidad, Mauritius feels a lot like Naipaul's Trinidad. And the reason I visited Mauritius is that the explorer, the naval captain Matthew Flinders, who explored the coast of Australia at the beginning of the 19th century, and my university is named after him, of course, Flinders University. He was detained in Mauritius by the French governor at the time. A fellow researcher has received, I've just read a very perceptive remark about the effect on Flinders of being a foreigner in Mauritius among the French settlers and the African slaves. And he said, the cultural displacement often combines with solitude to broaden the mind and deepen one's self-knowledge, leading to moments of epiphany and hence self-development. The traveller's marginality leads to the gradual erosion of one's identity, and the forging of a new and more complex one. And I think that's a very perceptive statement by Serge Riviere. And as we will see in my lecture about the late Yasmin Gunaratne, who only died within the last 2 weeks, when she was in Australia, that possibly applies to her as well. Now, Matthew Flinders was the first person to actually, not the first person, the first European to actually visit many parts of the Australian coast. He was the person who wanted to call the country Australia, that before it was a political unit, he wanted to call that landmass Australia. It wasn't until after his death that it was adopted, but he was the one who suggested it. But the relations between the Indigenous people and those who come to settle or to conquer or to invade, whatever word describes any particular situation, and these situations are always particular, and that's very important, I think. But these things are very usually uneasy. There have been terrible atrocities in Australian history, especially between people taking up land which they have bought from the colonial government, or they have been granted by the colonial government, and the people who had lived on that land and cared for it over millennia. 60,000 years the Aboriginal Australians had been there before the settlers, the British settlers came. Many massacres are only now being acknowledged, and I have deep respect for those of my colleagues who are doing this vital work of excavating this history. Actual massacres, I don't think are happening now, I hope not, but we live with the legacy of these terrible events. European farming methods don't work well in much of Australia, and the environmental damage caused by European settlement is vast and catastrophic, and only recently being acknowledged and countered in various ways. So, Australian society in my childhood was very Anglo and monocultural. I didn't really, until I moved to Adelaide, which was in 1980, I hardly saw an Aboriginal person. That was when I was 24. But now there is, Aboriginal society is much more visible, much more recognised. There is still racism, but there is also a celebration of our society. and the subaltern, the Aboriginal people themselves, have started to have a voice. It's now common for the local place names and the language groups to be known by the broad range of the people who live there. My city, Adelaide, is on the land of the Kaurna, the Ngarrindjeri and Paramount. And for us, it's now becoming increasingly important to acknowledge that fact when we speak about these we speak about anything on that land. It doesn't matter what the subject of a seminar or a conference is, we will make that acknowledgement at the beginning. Anyway, I won't go on, but the richness of Australian literature reflects our diverse society, and there are wonderful Aboriginal writers such as Kim Scott, Alexis Wright, Natalie Harkin, Ali Cobby Eckerman, and many others enrich our literary scene immeasurably since the days in the middle 20th century, when literary movements such as the Jingi Warabak movement, which actively sought to create a genuinely Australian literature inclusive of the Aboriginal influence, but not yet, wasn't able yet to really include Aboriginal voices very much. But many of the greatest Australian writers come from our migrant communities as well. So although I think people often identify with one cultural group or another, it is best to acknowledge, while we each have our own diversity and our own marginality, that we're all human beings and the racial differences.
But let's look at it. Music. I like to watch the New York Symphony Orchestra playing together, and there's one conductor, and all the different instruments are playing with precision, and it forms a beautiful harmony. And you can know when someone is out of tune. I feel as if your program here is moving under the conductor of a Vice Chancellor in that realm, where I can see bigger and bigger conferences not only reaching to the south, but in many other parts of the world. I heard you mention something about the Caribbean studies, and I got excited because that's one of my areas that I'm interested in. And maybe that will attract people of Indian descent, of African descent, of Australian descent that are settling in some of the nicer places, if I'm allowed to say that, in the Caribbean, as Derek Walcott mentioned. And then you have the dancing, whether it's a square dance, a group of people, whether it's two people, dancing. And the beauty is the movement. And when you practice, and you make sure you don't step on each other's feet, but you're moving in rhythm. And that is perhaps a beautiful imagery of what we can achieve in a program like this, where Australian studies and Indian studies, not replacing the British studies, but collaborating with them and inviting the Caribbean, maybe the United States, maybe the South African, and get this program moving in that realm. And then I think the other imagery is the athletic. One of the races I want to look at is the relay, passing the baton. There's an interesting imagery. My wife was into that. But there's an interesting imagery. You could be the fastest team, but if you drop the baton, you can lose the race. If you know how to pass the baton and receive the baton, you can win the race. And I think what I see here is a synergy of generations. The fact that we have people like Professor Darwin and my generation and younger generations, students, it means that if we communicate the vision well, if we pass the baton well, and one of the interesting things is that the person who is passing the baton never stops running when he hands the stick. He continues to run. the person who is receiving the baton never waits there to receive the baton, but starts running before receiving the baton. And it's a fine climate of transition, of passing and receiving for the effectiveness of what goes on forever. So those three imageries I want to mention. And I want to say quickly that it is now 30 years since I moved from the north, living in New York City, Chicago City, Pennsylvania, where I did my PhD, to the south. It was like moving to a different country in America. And I moved there particularly to be the first faculty that was hired. I didn't start the program, but I was hired as the first faculty in what was then a graduate multicultural literature program, one of 3 programs in the nation. Today you have many. Today that program is now called MTLFF, Multicultural and Transnational Literature, Film and Folklore. And we've hired faculty in Native America, African American, Hispanic American, and many others there. We also have a course called Folklore Literature, for Native literature. And to see that it's grown to be one of the fastest growing programs in that university there, because not only of the diversity element, but also because of the technology element. It's one of 2 programs that is offered entirely also online. And so I say to you, I wish you all the best. And I close with this imagery, that I see this as, I used to say this sometime before, as a great sequoia tree that is grown in the desert of California. These trees can go up to 300 feet tall. The irony is, the roots are just 1 foot deep. And with the enormous wind, how come they are able to withstand those strong winds? Because there is a system that as they grow, they intertwine their roots with other sequoia trees, and they form a strong collision. 2 are better than 1. A 3/4 cord, who can break? And so your program will be like a sequoia tree, because the unity of India and Australia, and if you get 3, 4, 4, I think you can form a strong foundation from which you will be able to withstand all the oppositions.
Thank you so much, sir, for deliberating on the powerful impact of music and dance in creating that humane multicultural